We're now going to move swiftly on to our next segment. So this is a presentation from Aimee Rudolph from Beta Hatch, Innovating Insects for a Sustainable Food System. I'm loving the title already. Beta Hatch is a super interesting new startup that's essentially farming insects, and they just secured a new large space in Yakima. Aimee has extensive background in business development, sales, and quality assurance with companies ranging from startups to Fortune 100 corporations, including 3M.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here, and it's wonderful to be talking to a group of people who surely shares the passion that I have for sustainability, and in particular for solving the inefficiencies and problems in our food system. Just a second. So it wouldn't be a surprise, I'm sure, to anyone in this group that a third of all of our food globally is wasted. And this slide actually comes from the FAO, from their data on food waste. And there's a lot here, so I would encourage you to look at their website and you can see the detail behind all of this. But ultimately, the message that I want to communicate is that food waste comes from a lot of different places, and it comes from both how we choose to grow food and what we choose to grow, and also how we go about moving it around the world. And Beta Hatch is aiming to really hit all of those directions to start to solve this problem and create a food system that is actually sustainable. And animal feed is a cornerstone to the food supply chain. And right now, feed is half the cost of meat. And a lot of the reason for that is these other bullets that you see on the screen. So if you look at how we grow grains and food, they're harvested seasonally and regionally. And when you think about where animals are eating them, that's happening year round all over the world. So you already have this immediate, very large inefficiency of getting feed from these regions to all of these other places, necessitating storage and long supply chains. And already 30% of our cropland is used to feed animals. So you start to see that human food competes with animal feed, creating even further inefficiencies. And this makes for an unpredictable supply chain with very volatile pricing. So animal feed needs to evolve to follow these changing trends in meat. So Beta Hatch is scaling the farming of insects to create a sustainable food supply chain. And there's a lot of facets to this, and I'll try to talk about all of them in about 15 minutes. But our first insect that we're farming is the yellow mealworm, the Tenebrio molitor. And we've chosen it because we think this insect is particularly amenable to scale. And that's a lot because it's historically a stored grain pest. And as such, it requires really no water to be added to the process during its raising. And you can see the life cycle here. So it's actually a beetle as an adult. The beetle lays an egg. The egg becomes a larva, which is actually the mealworm that we harvest as animal feed. And the frass, or insect manure, can be used as a fertilizer for crops that requires no processing. And then the pupa goes back to become an adult insect again. So these insects can be produced year-round. They can be grown locally anywhere, and I'll talk a bit more about the importance later on of growing feed near to where it will be consumed. So we want these to be grown locally, and we can retrofit old barns and warehouses that aren't being used to function as insectaries. These insects are dry adapted, they're biorecyclers, and they are a natural part of many animal diets already. They're also very nutrient dense, especially when you compare them to some other plant-based alternatives and even other insects. And it's also worth noting that this concept of insects as animal feed may sound very new, even to people who are very familiar with the sustainability and food system spaces. But this industry is very large. So the feed industry itself, depending on where you look, is over $500 billion industry. And that industry is really recognizing the need for alternative sources of protein for animals. And in particular, fish meal is something that is not a particularly sustainable feed ingredient and is very widely used, especially in aquaculture, which is one of our primary targets. And this industry is growing very fast, and the demand right now far outstrips the supply that Beta Hatch and all of the other insect companies combined can meet. So we produce two primary agricultural products. One is the animal feed. So the entire insect can be used as a feed ingredient, and a fertilizer, which can be applied directly to fields to grow crops. And we sell into these three primary markets are our first targets. So we are looking at aquaculture and pet food first, followed by poultry. And also, I wanted to mention that because these insects are grown their entire lifetime indoors in a climate controlled facility, they are disease free. There's no fear of heavy metals. They eat organic waste byproducts. And unlike plants, they're much more, I guess I should say, a lot of animals have difficulty digesting plant-based proteins. So insect protein is much easier on their digestive system. So while tackling the feed component is a very important part of what Beta Hatch is doing, so using these waste feed streams, things like spent brewers grains, things like other dried byproducts from industrial grain production that don't compete with human food to create this feed source, that solves one component of the challenge that we have in having a sustainable food supply chain. The other challenge is this operating model. And if you look at some other insect companies and some other solutions, they're very focused on this large factory model. And we believe that feed really needs to be produced near to where it's consumed. So we're using this hub and spoke approach, and we are right now building our first flagship facility in Kashmir, Washington. That facility will operate entirely as a hatchery, and this is modeled after successful models in poultry and swine and other livestock, in which we'll produce eggs, and those eggs will be supplied to a distributed network of insect production ranches that are co-located with things like feedstocks that the insects can eat or animals who will consume the feed, and other byproduct sources. And you can quickly start to see how that will also put jobs and, more importantly, future focused jobs back into rural communities. Sorry, guys, having some slide flipping difficulties here. So I've made it sound fairly simple to produce insects. They're a grain pest, they're very hardy, but there is a lot of knowledge that you need to understand in order to be able to grow insects at these scales. And being able to understand what they can eat, how they will process it, what the growing times will be, requires a lot of understanding and research. And so we're innovating with new feedstocks from waste. And this is where we talk a little bit about you are what you eat. So Beta Hatch insects can eat all sorts of things, from canola meal to dried distillers grains. But what you feed them will obviously affect the nutritional profile of the insect itself and also the frass. So what you're seeing in that photo is insect frass from different diets. And you can see visually the differences that you get, and that mirrors itself in the actual nutritional makeup of the products. And a lot of our research is funded by the USDA and also by DARPA and NSF, because food security is a very important topic for the US government and also for governments around the world. And it contributes to political stability. If people are able to eat and feed themselves, there's just a lot of stability and benefit that comes from that. And some of our diet research led us into looking at mycotoxins. And mycotoxins are residues left behind by fungus that cause health problems in animals and humans. And you'll find that up to 90% of feedstocks are contaminated with mycotoxin around the world. And right now, the solution is dilution. So these mycotoxins are present in feed. And what we do is we either have to dispose of that feed entirely, contributing to that food waste you saw on the first slide, or we just sort of divvy it up in very small volumes that we've decided are safe for people to eat. Or if you're in a developing country where you don't have that kind of infrastructure, you really see health effects in both humans and livestock. And what we found is that mealworms can actually completely handle mycotoxins. So they can be used to completely bioremediate feeds that are mycotoxin contaminated. And so what you're seeing here, DON is a type of mycotoxin. It's the most prevalent and most common one, which is why we chose to study it. And you can actually feed those contaminated grains to mealworms and they can eat them, and both the feed and the fertilizer have 0 or less than 1 ppm of DON left behind. And that is actually the detection limit of the test. And this slide is just showing how it doesn't appear to matter how much biotoxin or how much mycotoxin is present in the feed. In all cases, the mealworms were able to reduce that level to 0 or near 0. Beta Hatch is also innovating waste utilization in other ways. So in our facility that we're building right now in Kashmir, we have co-located with a data center to make use of the low-grade waste heat in order to heat and humidify the growing spaces. So electricity from humidification represents at least half of the electrical load and a significant amount of the cost to power the facility. So you can see a small picture there on the left side showing the custom sensors that we've created for environmental monitoring of our grow rooms and systems. And right now, that's one of our biggest projects we have underway is getting these electrical systems and air handling systems exactly right for what the insects need and being able to make use of this waste heat, because scaling insects to the volumes that we need to scale to, cost is something that we have to work really hard to keep down, to keep under control. And this is one way that we can do that. So this is our flagship production facility. I'm very excited. We are under construction. Beta Hatch just closed our Series A this fall. So we have raised over $18 million so far for the business, and this is one of our biggest milestones yet. We currently operate a pre-commercial facility that's much smaller, but we are fully operating in SeaTac, Washington right now. So we're under construction for our flagship facility and expect to be online in Q2 of 2021. And when that happens, we will be the largest mealworm production facility in North America. Very stubborn slide flips today. Sorry about that. So thank you very much for your time and for listening. And I'd be happy to answer any questions we have time for.
Yeah, thanks, Aimee. Such an interesting concept. I wonder whether I can start with a question. And maybe this is because I've got the Great British Bake Off in my mind. But I wondered whether the animals, do they have a reaction to the taste? Do you have any data on how they like the food produced?
We do. So I wish we had our chief science officer here. He has a diet development program that he calls the Mealworm Buffet. And it does exactly what you're talking about. And I don't know how much of that is their taste preference. We assume, I think, that their taste preference is tied to their nutritional needs. So he actually sets up his Mealworm Buffet for them. And we look to see and study which diets they prefer. And we design our studies around those.
And then I have another question, which is the greenhouse gas emissions from cattle in particular are pretty huge. Do you collect data on the sort of greenhouse gas methane emissions that come from animals using your feed?
One of the projects that is high on our list for 2021 is to do a full life cycle analysis of exactly what this looks like. And so the short answer to your question is no, we haven't done that work specifically on mealworms. However, they don't produce methane gas to my knowledge. So I am fully expecting this to be a much lower number than what you're going to see with cattle. And that is one of the drivers behind utilizing insect protein.
I think we've got a question from Heather Trim. Heather, do you want to unmute yourself to ask?
Yeah, that was awesome. I love it. So a couple of questions. One, how long do the little insects live? I guess, what's your turnover rate on your insects? And then two, how are you in a price point compared to other feeds from the perspective of the people who are buying your product?
Yeah, so to your timing question, there's a few ways to answer that. So this will be a flow through system. So we will actually harvest insects every day because of the way we'll essentially seed those trays. So this will be a constant production process. The insects themselves, the life cycle can be anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 to 4 months, depending on what you feed them and how healthy they are, essentially. Oh, and sorry, that was a lot of questions. Your question to cost. So we are right now, one of the challenges of raising insects is exactly that, it's cost. We need to reach economies of scale in order to reach price parity with fish meal, which is actually our first target. We are able to sell right now into the backyard chicken market while we're pursuing regulatory approvals in pets and in aquaculture. So in the early phase of selling this product into feed markets, we will be targeting organic aquaculture farms, organic poultry farms, places where we can command a higher price point while we continue to scale. And yes, we can reach price parity with fish meal once we have enough ranches online.
We've had a question around maybe the other insects that might be being considered by you, and if are there, and if so, what's the criteria that you use to select?
Yeah, so people farm a lot of insects. Black soldier fly is the other major insect that's grown for feed purposes, and some for you'll see some protein bars and things like that for human food. Crickets as well. We chose the mealworm in particular because we think it's very amenable to scaling, because it's a grain pest, because it has a very simple life cycle. It also, this will sound funny, but it smells nice. And one of the things that we want to be able to do is farm this within communities. And some of the pushback you get with an insect like black soldier fly, it has a very complex life cycle. It flies, which also complicates things when you're talking about insect rearing. And it produces a lot of ammonia, which is very smelly, and you might not necessarily want that in your neighborhood or co-located with your brewery to use your grains or whatever. So there's a lot of reasons why, and those are a few. We think the mealworm is the best choice. We do have the capability to grow black soldier fly and other insects. Our CEO and chief science officer are both PhD entomologists, and we just think that the mealworm is the best starting place.
And then thinking about sort of where you get your product from, where can you buy the feed for backyard chickens in particular?
Yeah, you can buy our backyard chicken feed right now from Chubby Mealworms. They're at chubbymealworms.com. So those are beta hatch products, and they're all grown here in the US.
Great. We have one more minute for another question if one wants to come in. And if not, I might take us on break a minute early. Well, thanks so much, Aimee, for that presentation. It was very thought-provoking for me. And it sort of got me thinking about sort of eating insects generally, which I'll probably be dreaming about later. So thanks for that.
Well, thank you so much for having me.